Terrific. Okay, terrific. So formal introductions here. Nancy Nunn will be our first presenter, and Nancy is with the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agro-Ecology. And she will do more detailed introduction, I think, but I just want to mention that Nancy is with the Agro-Ecology Center, and that is with the at the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law. So that's where the Harry Hughes Center for Agriculture resides. So Nancy will be our first presenter, and Sarah Everhart is a senior legal specialist at the Agriculture Law Education Initiative at the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law. I think I mixed that up, didn't I? Yeah, sorry about that. Let me just do that again. My one job and I'm messing it up. So Nancy is affiliated with the University of Maryland College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. All right. And then Sarah is also the University of Maryland, but with the Francis King Carey School of Law. All right, sorry about that, folks. Why don't we move into the presentation, and welcome again to everybody. I will turn it over to Nancy.
Thank you, Liz. As Liz said, I'm with the Harry Hughes Center for Agro-Ecology, and we are a 501c3, which was founded in 1999. Really around the Listeria scare. And the idea was to get diverse viewpoints into one room to have a conversation and to try to come up with solutions to some of the issues that were surrounding ag and the environment at that time. Our mission is to provide leadership to promote environmentally sound and economically viable ag and forestry as Maryland's preferred land use. And we do that through funding scientific research, outreach programs, and collaborations. And I know that some of the names that I saw as participants, we have worked with you before. So thank you for joining us.
And I work for the Agriculture Law Education Initiative. We are a group of attorneys at 3 different parts of the University of Maryland. So no problem, Liz. There's a lot of parts of the University of Maryland involved with this process. I work at the law school, as Liz said, and then I have colleagues at University of Maryland College Park and the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Our job is to provide legal education and outreach to farmers throughout the state of Maryland. So we have our website handle there, our Facebook, and our email. One quick plug, we do have an agricultural and environmental law conference coming up on November 17th and 18th. It's virtual, it's only $35, and we're going to be featuring a whole host of issues that affect Maryland's environmental law folks, farmers. We kind of run the gamut. We try to focus on new legislative hot topics and things to look out for in 2022. So if you've got time in your schedule on November 17th and 18th, you can go on over to our website and we'd love to have you. Quick disclaimer, I'm an attorney, but I'm here with my educator hat on today. So I'm only providing education, not legal advice. If you need legal advice, you need to consult your individual attorney.
So we're going to start out with a quick poll. Approximately what percentage of U.S. farmland do you think is leased? And I know some people have already responded, and Liz, I think either Liz or Sarah is going to provide the results.
Yeah, it looks like we have some responses in the poll responses. 39%, 39%. I'm looking at the question options. So 0 to 20, 0 to 21, 39%, 5 to 21, 43%, and over 50%, 54%, looks like, which would, in terms of the response, would discourage conservation practices. That question of why would a short-term lease discourage conservation practices? I'm having a little bit trouble interpreting the responses here, but
So how many folks have chosen 39%, Liz?
we have 20. Nobody has selected that.
Huh. So you also mentioned.
Actually, that's not correct. I'm corrected here, 39%.
Okay, and you
Thanks,
also
Sarah.
mentioned someone that had chosen 43%. So Sarah, if you'll go to the next slide. I actually believe there might be a ringer in the room. When we talk about Maryland farmland, approximately 43% of it is leased. And that's pretty, the 40 to 45% is pretty standard throughout the nation. So
Yeah, the right answer on that last one technically was 39. So according to the last census of ag, nationally it's 39, and in Maryland we're at 43. So we're about par for the national average.
So as you can see, it's really important that conservation practices be considered and implemented on leased land, because they do play such a significant role in the number of the amount of ag land that we're talking about. And specifically in this region, because of the Bay cleanup efforts and the TMDL, they are going to play a significant role in the next couple of years. So we're going to go to another poll. This one's going to be fun for all of us because we've never done a word cloud before. So why do you think conservation practices are less prevalent on leased farmland? I guess, are we referring to Liz or to Sarah? I don't know which one of you want to.
Liz, you're muted.
Sorry about that, folks. Okay, we've got a word cloud. Results are coming in. So we've got some responses. Talk to owners, no-till farming, no ownership, short lease ag. They won't let me. So some good responses there. Capitalism, okay. Cost, risky, unreachable. Okay, these are some reasons why conservation practices are less prevalent on farmland.
So the next slide.
And funding.
Mhm. So when Sarah and I were doing the workshops and our outreach for the conservation leasing work through Sarah that we did for 3 years and we're continuing, you hit upon many of the issues that we heard from both farmers as well as landowners. Lack of communication between the parties. What we have found is in recent years, a number of the landowners no longer live in the area. So it's not that, you know, hi, I've passed you in the grocery store, I see you every day. It's a little bit more difficult to communicate. Leasing uncertainty. Sarah is particularly good at explaining this one, but farmers are hesitant, you know, to put in practices when they don't know if they're going to still have that same lease the next year. Decision making, who makes the decision between the two parties, and lack of knowledge of farming and conservation practices. So it's really a mixture. And what we have found is every situation is a little bit different, and sometimes it's a combination of one or two of those factors.
So we've talked about some of our challenges. We're going to give you some steps to try to address these challenges and hopefully use a lease to provide the foundation that both parties need, the landowner and the farmer, when we're talking about trying to put conservation on a leased farm. So I'm going to give you a couple of the steps that we have designated as part of the process. First step, can't underscore enough the importance of communication. So, many of you threw something along those lines in the poll. If you're not able to reach the landowner, if the farmer and landowner are not talking about the farm, if they haven't been able to reach consensus, it's unlikely that we're going to have conservation on that farm. So establishing communication is a really important part of that process. You all are going to have a link and access to the Conservation Leasing Guide, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we've got quite a few communication tools in that guide. Alternative lease forms. I'll talk about the role that can play. The lease term is another incredibly vital part of this process. Setting farming standards. So not assuming that you're on the same page with how the farm should be farmed, making sure that you have a conversation so that you're clear about the standard of farming that you both expect. Making sure you don't forget about all the costs that are associated with conservation, and we'll talk about those various costs. Addressing specific practices. So we'll give you, some options if you're just starting in the process, starting sort of broadly with setting some conservation standards, and then, getting more narrow depending on the two parties and the farm involved about whether or not there are specific practices you want to talk about in your lease. And then last but not least, agreeing to review and revise the lease. So, as an attorney, I can't, emphasize enough that a lease should be a living document. And by that, I mean, you don't sign it, put it on your shelf and don't think about it for 10 years. It only is going to be helpful for both parties if it's actually reflective of what's going on the farm, actually reflective of your situation, what you've agreed to. So, it should be something that you pull out annually and both parties take a look at it. And if anything needs to be changed, it should be changed. All right, so this is the main resource that we created for this project and that we want to just share with all of you. It's our Agricultural Conservation Leasing Guide. And like Nancy said, we were very thankful for some grant support from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, mouthful, SARE. So thanks again to them. How we wanted this resource to function is we wanted it to be valuable for all sorts of folks in this process. So, experienced farmers all the way, on the other side of the spectrum to folks that are new to farmland ownership, maybe someone who bought a farm recently or someone who inherited a farm. So we started with the basics about who the different players are in this process. And then we talk about what and how of the conservation on leased farmland, and I'll get into that. So who? And so we're going to be walking you guys through some of these examples and some of these steps. And then towards the end of our presentation, you're going to have an opportunity in small groups to work through some scenarios. So as I go along and as Nancy goes along today, keep some of this in mind because you'll have to put some of this into practice here in a minute because we don't want anybody to fall asleep on our Zoom. So who? There are federal folks and state folks and folks in the private sector who are all in a position to help farmers and landowners put conservation onto leased farmland. So in Maryland, we've got our extension service. They're incredibly helpful in this process. I work with them often, and in the leasing context, they can work with farmers and landowners. They can serve a really important educational role. So they have a base of expertise with these conservation practices. And because they're throughout the state, they've also got regional expertise. So they'd be a great person to be sort of an intermediary between a new landowner and a farmer to help a landowner who wants to come up to speed and understand more about farming, but maybe doesn't want to ask those questions directly to the farmer. So they play a very important sort of neutral educational role in the process. Then we have the Natural Resource Conservation Service. That is a federal office. It's a department of the USDA, and their job is federal technical assistance for conservation practices. So they're going to help you get these practices on the ground, and they're going to help you work with the Farm Service Agency for funding for these different practices. They can also be a really important part of this. And NRCS and then the soil conservation districts, we have a soil conservation district in every county in the state. Those again are technical advisors. Those folks are going to help you create a farm specific conservation plan. And so if you don't have a farm specific conservation plan, it's free. It's often required for a lot of cost share programs. So if you're thinking about applying for federal or state cost share, in a lot of cases, you're going to need that conservation plan. And we'll talk throughout the presentation today about how important that plan can be in this process. And then last but not least, we've got non-governmental organizations. So I'm sure we've got some representatives from some NGOs on the presentation today as participants. We've got organizations like the Nature Conservancy, like Shore Rivers, who are more than willing to talk to farmers and to help facilitate conservation onto farms. In terms of the what, we're talking about leasing and communication strategies for each party to consider. So there's different ways to think about those communication and different ways to structure the lease that will help it be more favorable to support conservation. And then the how is how are we going to get these specific practices on the ground, and how are we going to make sure that they're properly maintained and that they don't end up being disruptive to the leasing relationship.
So the first area we talk about is how you kickstart that communication. And it may be with both parties in the room, or it may be that you talk to the landowner and then you talk to the farmer. It's really trying to find out what is driving their decisions. So to the landowner, you might want to start a conversation as simple as, what are your plans for this property? Some landowners, it's getting the most profit from the farm. Others, I want it to be held for future generations, and I want the land to be in good shape for future generations. Others, it may be, it was my father's farm, but I would like to change some of the practices, and this particular, the environment is more important to me. So you really need to understand that person. And for the farmer, it's, you farm this, what are the characteristics of this farm that could be improved? And what are some methods that we might use to improve that? And it would also be, what is your relationship with that landowner? How can I help that relationship? And how should we start this conversation? So some of the questions to ask are, how could conservation practices benefit this land? As Sarah said, we'll often talk about the conservation plan. Is there a problem with water on the property? Is there an area that maybe isn't quite as good for planting? So you really need to look at what are the needs. And as Sarah said, there's a lot of help out there from NRCS, Soil Conservation District, Extension, and as she said, in many times, the local NGOs that work with that individual farm. What impacts, and this will particularly be probably important to the farmer, what impact will the practices have on my bottom line? But it's going to be important to both parties. And what are you willing to contribute? And that can become a little tricky because, it could be a mixture of these three. Is the landowner willing to pay for the practice? Are they anticipating that the farmer should share that cost of that practice to implement it? And, or could the farmer provide the maintenance or provide the labor to put that practice in? And that really all needs to be hashed out ahead of time. Finally, how can we make implementation and maintenance equitable? How are we going to make this work for all of us? And if it matters, it should probably be in the lease, because you don't want to have that come back. Any of those conversations and a misunderstanding come back later after either the project's in the process or has been implemented.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. I think that's incredibly important. So, we're advocating for a lease in this process to provide a lot of different types of support. It's going to give that farmer assurance, and another incredibly important role that it plays is just to reduce misunderstandings, to reduce the chance for legal conflict. Our hope for this project is that we're going to preserve these leasing relationships. We hear from a lot of folks across the state who, are happy with their farmer. They don't want to disrupt that relationship, and the farmer wants to continue to till that land as well. And so all we're, sort of throwing out there for your consideration is to put, that handshake into a simple form, or if you've got, a year-to-year lease, take a look at it and consider whether or not, it can be tweaked to, in any number of ways that we're talking about today, to provide a little bit more support, to be a little bit more specific, because we all know memories fade, and that's when conflicts can occur. So, type of lease. Conservation practices may present some risks to profitability, right? It's when we're talking about conservation practices, it's a broad term. We're talking about a lot of different things, but it's an important thing to consider. And if you've always been functioning under a fixed cash rent lease, maybe it's time to consider a different form of lease. So a crop share lease is going to allow you to both share in the risk. And it's also maybe something you need to consider if you're looking at federal conservation programs, because some of those require that both parties share in the risk for eligibility purposes. So you might need to consider a different type of lease. Term of the lease. So, short leases discourage farmers to use conservation practices. So this is another poll question that we're going to ask you all to give us some answers. Why is that? Why do short leases discourage farmers from using conservation practices?
I will start to share the responses to keep us moving along in our program. And we have those responses include cost, risk, because these processes can often take several years to implement. So these are some of the responses. Non-invest, no incentive to implement practices, no ownership. So those are some of the responses. Why don't we keep moving along to pick up a little time?
Yeah, we 100% agree with all those responses. These things take time. And so a year-to-year lease is just not going to give the assurance that we necessarily need. Okay, length of the lease. Nancy, do you want to cover this one?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right, so I'll keep moving. So why might landowners be hesitant to enter into long-term farm leases? Got some ideas in the chat box for that one?
Just looking for the results. Folks, no government funding, won't let me talk to landowners, no commitment, economic pain, or economic gain rather. Do those responses align with your question there?
Yeah, I think that's true. There's a lot of different reasons why landowners are hesitant to do that. It's easy for us to say, long-term leases are the way to go. So, give your farmer a very long lease. It's not going to necessarily work for everybody. I think the important thing for landowners, farmers, and all of us that work with these folks is just to be able to communicate how important that term is and the impacts that that term can have, extending that term. We really saw a lot of light bulbs go off with the landowners that we were able to reach in our work thus far when we explained to them, hey, if you move from a year to year to a 4 or 5 year lease, that farmer's going to farm that land differently. They're going to farm that land more like they do with their home farm, and sometimes that really hadn't occurred to landowners. And, so it's an important thing to just be able to communicate through this process that if you're able to, it can have a big impact. Here's some alternative to longer lease terms because, hey, I know it's not for everybody. We're in sort of a crazy real estate market right now. And so, people might be hesitant because they're not really quite sure where things are going to go. Some simple alternatives, you can include a renewal provision. It's not going to give, permanent, it's not going to give you 100% assurance, but if just having a renewal provision in your lease, can at least give you the option to exercise that renewal. Moving on to some things that might be a little bit more attractive to farmers, a right of first offer. So I can't tell you how many times farmers call me and they are mad and disappointed because they were under the assumption that maybe they would get the opportunity to buy the farm they had been farming for so many years. And maybe change in circumstance, death in the family, it doesn't end up happening, and there's conflict and bad feelings all around. So just by giving a right of first offer, and that would need, you'd need some legal assistance to draft that up. It would have to be negotiated, or a right of first refusal. So they had a reasonable amount of time to get some financing in place and match the offer to purchase the farm. Both of those things, if you're in a situation where your plan is to sell the farm at some point, it's something to consider. Nancy, you want to talk about establishing some standards?
Sure. So one thing to back up on the earlier slide that Sarah was talking about, and one of the things we really haven't mentioned is sometimes there are multiple parties that are the landowners. So it may be that a parent left the farm to multiple children. So it's also really important to find out who is the spokesperson for those children, so that you're not having a conversation with one person only to find out that Joe the son in DC is the one that is actually the spokesperson, or the person who's the main trust holding the trust. So because we've seen disappointment occur that way also. So establishing farming standards. This is just some sample language that could be included. And basically it just says that the tenant farmer is going to follow as much as possible and implement the best management practices and natural resource strategies as outlined in the conservation plans. And then you attach the conservation plan to the lease and you date it. So that's one way of addressing the issues. Okay, so this was another question. What are some of the costs associated with on-farm conservation practices? And Liz, I don't know if you have that.
Yeah, I do. Thank you. So we have some of the responses include construction, time, training, risk, labor equipment, seed equipment, startup, loss of land, cover crops, and maintenance. So those are some of the responses there.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with all those. You guys hit a lot of the ones that we typically hear about. When we started this project, we heard a lot of concern from farmers about maintenance costs. It was along the lines of, oh boy, please don't wind up those landowners about conservation practices, because it's going to cost me time, it's going to cost me money. And sometimes that's not fully considered, right? A lot of the cost share programs are focused on initial implementation costs. How much is this going to cost to put in the ground? And those secondary impacts, the yield or profit losses, the maintenance costs, aren't necessarily fully realized. So really important when you're meeting with those experts at NRCS or Soil Conservation District, or just talking to the farmer, what are going to be the long-term costs of this? And how can we equitably share in those costs, right? So some ideas, we have a bunch of different ideas in the guide. We'll highlight a few today. Discounted rent. I know that's not always the most popular idea, but it's definitely one. Program payments can be shared. We've got a great webinar with state and federal experts about how program payments can be shared on the Hughes Center Conservation Leasing site, if anyone's interested in that. And then again, there's some non-monetary things that you can do, like giving somebody a longer lease term, seeing if that would be appealing to someone. So here's a sample provision for reducing rent, reducing it by a dollar figure, or reducing it by a percentage each year, if you feel like that's the most equitable way to sort of share in some of those costs. Oh, sorry. And then the next thing, we'll move on to addressing specific practices. So this is a document that, this isn't necessarily something that an experienced farmer would need, but if you're assisting a landowner who needs a little bit more information about conservation practices from the Department of Agriculture, it's very helpful in breaking down the specific practices, explaining what these specific practices are, how they're appropriate, why they're appropriate, where in the state they'd be appropriate. So it can be a good resource. I'll let Nancy talk about conservation tillage.
The conservation tillage is one of the practices. And as you know, conservation tillage is used to manage the components of crop and other plant residual on the ground. And you could talk about limiting tillage, which would increase the organic matter, allow the soil to hold more moisture, and to provide more nutrients to crops. One thing I will say, and I think Sarah pointed out really well, it's important to share a document like this, because if you go in and you start having these conversations, and I'm sure you've all seen it, not just in this field, but in other areas, and you start throwing terminology or acronyms around that aren't known to the party, even NRCS or, extension or whatever, make sure you explain it, because you'll lose the person right from the start. I've been guilty of it. So what are some of the considerations if you want to adopt this? Is the farmer willing to adopt it? Does he have the equipment? Is there going to have to be an investment made in the equipment? Is the field suitable, and is it more suitable for either reduced or no-till? And can you phase it? Would that be more beneficial? So it's really just looking at the entirety and what's going to work best for that particular situation. So, and Sarah's been kind enough to provide some sample lease provisions again. And as you see, we always try to refer back to the Department of Ag's standards or standards from one of the agencies. And we also always try to refer back to the conservation plan. So we're looking at it holistically.
And I can walk through this one. So, this is another one for riparian buffer. And we're giving you these examples just because, like Nancy said, it's important to define these terms, not to assume that both parties understand what you mean when you're talking about a riparian buffer. And so, we've just provided you here with a definition, but that conservation choices document, or many of the experts we've been pointing you to, they can help you with that definition. If it's not possible for you to both walk the farm and talk about it, these are the types of communications you can have. This is what we're thinking about. We're thinking about a buffer. All right, well, what is that really going to mean in terms of implementation? Are we going to be getting some kind of cost share payments for it? Will those cost share payments be shared? Who's going to be responsible for maintaining the buffer? If the farmer's going to be assuming that responsibility, how are they going to be compensated? And so, with all these samples, we put these together to give you a starting point. I encourage you to use an individual attorney to draft a lease and refine a lease. But, just some considerations, making sure you're very clear in the lease about how, the length of the buffer, the width of the buffer. Buffers shrink over time. We hear that from a lot of people involved with these processes, that, you want to make sure that both parties are very clear about where that buffer should be. And what the farmer can and can't do in that buffer. So, make it abundantly clear what can't be done in the vegetative buffer, and then the maintenance responsibilities, based on the recommended standards of that type of a buffer. And finally, compensation. So if we're talking about a buffer, it might be possible to get some federal funding, and, maybe the best thing to do is to share in that funding. So I can do this one, agree to meet and verify. I mean, this is just back to where I started with, have an annual conversation about the farm. If you're not in the same region, you can't walk the farm together, do it however you can. Talk about the maintenance responsibilities. How's it going? Has the buffer shrunk? Is the buffer still in the same place? If one of the parties has signed up for the cost share, but the other one's handling the maintenance, those parties want to be in communication to make sure there's no confusion about that. Don't forget about tax obligations. So we've got a tax document on the Hughes Center website. I'll give you that link right here. And really what that's about is, we were hearing from folks throughout the state when the landowner was applying for conservation funding, cost share funding, and they're not familiar with receiving that type of funding. They were then getting some unwelcome tax surprises when that funding was treated as taxable income at tax time. And so that can lead to conflict, which is what we're trying to reduce. So good idea if it's a farmer-led conservation practice, if the farmer's, encouraging the landowner to apply for the funding, that's fine. Oftentimes parties feel it's the most appropriate, but just be clear with the landowner that accepting that income is going to have some tax consequences. And, finally amend that lease as needed. Strike through that lease, both initial, have a new one drafted, make sure that your lease is actually a mirror of what's going on the farm. All right, so I'm going to let Nancy talk about the work we're going to have you guys do.
All right, so we have developed 2 scenarios, and Alexandra, who I'd like to give a shout out to, who's been sort of our tech guru through this, is going to divide you into groups, small groups. And 2 of the groups are going to have scenario 1. 2 of the groups are going to have scenario 2. And we're going to ask you to identify a facilitator and a note taker. And for each one of them, we want you to really consider 3 questions. What can the parties do to facilitate communication? What partners can the parties work with? And what conservation leasing strategies can be used? And then we're going to regather in a little while and have a report out of what you talked about. In the meantime, if you do have any questions for either Sarah or myself, please put them in the chat and we will be happy to answer them. So, thank you for joining us. I think what Sarah would say is we found out traveling throughout the state and talking to people, each situation is a little bit different. There are some it's been an interesting couple of years, especially the amount of farmland that we have witnessed exchange hands in recent years in our area. And a large number of people have bought farmland that in many cases were just trying to move to remote areas. So there's a real need for communication and education. So we're really excited about continuing to work in this area. So
Sarah and Nancy, can we go into the breakouts and then we'll do some Q&A after the breakouts? Does that sound okay?
Sure.
All righty, is everybody ready to go into the breakout rooms? You've got your assignment. Nancy explained it very
farm could benefit. He knows the farm could benefit from a riparian buffer, but he's hesitant to either make the investment or assume the maintenance responsibilities on a leased land. And his landowner, Lisa, values conservation, but she lives out of state. She rarely comes to the farm, and the farm's conservation plan is out of date. And they have a year-to-year fixed rent lease. So what can the parties do to facilitate conservation? So I don't know. Was there a breakout group that had this scenario? And if so, can you report out?
Feel free to take yourself off mute if you want to share some input here. Unmute yourself, bottom lower left of the Zoom screen.
Okay, well, we may have all done scenario two, but
No, it looks like there's some people that did this scenario. Mary Hoover, Shannon Thomas, Jake Solis, and Sam Urban were in breakout group 3. If you have any insights you want to share.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about like kind of putting question 1 and 2 together, just bringing in a third party to help facilitate that conversation. And also maybe having the landowner come out and visit the site and just like be able to be a little bit more hands-on and see what's going on there.
that's great. And would you do anything about the conservation plan, which is outdated? Like who would you bring in to talk about that? Or do you think that's an important piece?
Yeah, we mentioned like working with NRCS and like the local FSA office as well, and bringing in some of those partners to kind of update the conservation plan, as well as see if any type of, riparian area or soil erosion, best management plans we could, work on.
Okay, great. Anything anybody else wants to add about this scenario?
I'll add to that as far as just other organizational agencies that may be able to help with that conservation plan. I know there are state entities and agencies as well, Department of Ag, Forestry, etc., that could help with even looking at those riparian buffers and the desire, if they're going to be planted to trees, then utilizing some of those expertise to be able to help with maybe even a long-term plan there.
It's an important point. Thank you, Leon. Okay, conservation leasing scenario number 2. In this case, we have Leah, landowner, and Farmer Dell. Leah's a recent landowner, and Farmer Dell has been on the farm, farming this land forever. They're doing it on a handshake deal, and they have a fixed rate rent base. The landowner's heard about conservation tillage, but she isn't quite sure what it is. And she wants to form a lease which sets expectations, but doesn't chase the farmer off the land. So what should these parties do?
I can kick things off for at least this breakout room. I think our first party kind of led off that first question of like, what can the parties do to facilitate communication, is definitely increase communication between landowner and the farmer. And some examples we gave are like asking Farmer Dell what his long-term interests are in the farm. Especially if there's an interest in conservation tillage, asking about necessary equipment. That's of course long-term investment, so that does lend hand in hand with the previous question. And just larger questions like the length of the lease, reserving the right to negotiate the lease. So I think a lot of the first communication needs to be around clarifying the lease.
Great. Okay, and the second question was, what partners could they work with? So any idea of what partners? I think that was Zoe, and we brought up some great people to, bring into that initial conversation. Are there other parties?
This is Kristen. We talked about the soil conservation districts, the Natural Resource Conservation Service Extension, potentially land preservation groups if there's interest in land preservation. And I think I heard somebody in the previous one talk about like state agencies, like if there's forest lands on the property. And one other thing about the lease, we talked about, well, I should say communication is, and this was Nancy, I appreciate you suggesting this, just talking about how the farmer and the landowner will communicate, like maybe how often, is it by phone call, or are they going to meet, a certain number of times, and just kind of also around partners, like facilitating informal relationships with their peers who might be able to share their personal experiences and support the effort.
Okay. And then the final question is, what conservation leasing strategies can be used? So we sort of addressed that. Anything else that group wants to add? Or anyone wants to add on this particular scenario?
I thought it was really good, Sarah, bringing in the points about like building flexibility into the lease. Like the lease needs a termination clause. If the farmer is willing to look into no-till or conservation tillage, but he isn't entirely sure, like I think someone on the team suggested like an opportunity to phase in practice. So maybe they don't have to do it right away. Also discussion about if cost share funding is received, who gets it, and just being clear about what the costs are to farm the land differently and what resources are available to support that and who those resources go to.
And I guess I have a question and maybe an answer to that question. I think we also discussed developing a conservation plan or update an existing one that not necessarily is fleshed out in like the example given, or like the the scenario given, apologies. But I assume the conservation plan would then cover some of these conservation strategies, leasing strategies, excuse me. Okay, nice. Thank you.
Yeah, we pitch it as a tool in a lot of these different categories, because the plan is going to have a host of suggested practices that the experts have found are going to be most beneficial for the farm. So it can, if in a situation like this one, the landowner heard about conservation tillage, and that may or may not be something, it probably would be something that would be suggested in the plan, but then the plan would probably have some other practices that that the local office, the NRCS and soil conservation folks would think is appropriate. So it can be a way to sort of open that conservation conversation door a little bit to more than just one specific practice.
Something I'll add to that as it pertains to the conservation plans, because those do change over time. And some of the objectives and requirements of the landowner may also change. Could be helpful as well to have that discussion when laying out the lease, what would be required conservation practices, as well as what would be some suggested or desired practices, so that both parties are aware of, hey, we will implement conservation tillage, on these fields or for these years. And the desire would be to implement other conservation practices if, the situation arises or if it works out financially for parties.
That's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Extremely important. That very wet weather that we had been having the last few years, it created some situations where farmers had to change practices, and some of them, were not able to participate in the cover crop program here in Maryland, or, they had to change the way they had farmed, and it was not something that parties in leasing relationships expected. So, important point that we want to, establish a foundation with the lease, but we don't want to paint people into a corner. And so that's why it's important to, to seek some good legal counsel to help you form your lease, because you want to set expectations, but allow for, you know, the variances that are going to occur, Mother Nature and other things that are going to come into play for sure. All right, well, it seems like we thank you guys very much for participating in that. I know it's close to lunch and we asked you to do homework, and it was great. So thanks for doing that. Oh, sorry.
Just take a minute. Why don't I just take a minute to thank everybody for participating? A really lively discussion, really good input, good points made. So Nancy Nunn, thank you very much. Sarah Everhart, thank you very much for that great insight. And we appreciate attendees in the room, including Sam and Leon and Zoe and Christian Hughes Evans, who shared good questions. There was one question came up in the chat box, and if it hasn't been answered, I wanted to raise it with Sarah and Nancy before we sign off here. What is considered a long-term lease is a question that came up. So if that question hasn't been answered, we have a couple minutes left before the session formally ends.
That is always a popular question, and it's not one with an easy answer. I would say 5 years is a long-term lease. I'll stick my neck out today and pick a number. I think, you know, 1-year leases are typical, and, you know, when we're talking about a longer lease, something closer to 5 years, I think would be a longer-term lease in terms of conservation, and it would provide some of the assurance that we're talking about is needed. You know, it's going to be a case-by-case scenario. A lot of these conservation practices are going to have lifespans. So it's another opportunity to talk about, you know, why does the lease need to be long? Well, the lease needs to be a certain amount of time because, you know, we've obligated ourselves to maintenance responsibilities for this practice for a certain amount of time, right? So a lot of different considerations, future plans of the parties, lifespan of the practice. I know folks don't like to be, you know, bound for long periods of time, but 5 years would be, I think, a good answer. All right, I'm seeing a plea in the chat box for sample leases. We're with you on that. So the guide has sample lease language for specific practices. The Agricultural Law Education Initiative has a general leasing guide that has sample full leases. And Nancy and I are continuing on with this effort. So hopefully stay tuned. We may be able to give you some full-scale conservation-minded leases in the future. We're working on it. We know the need is there. But at this point, I would say look at the Maryland Agricultural Leasing Guide for general different types of leases, and then look at the Conservation Leasing Guide. And you know, that should give you the information you need.
And I'm hopeful and optimistic that that Maryland leasing guide has application across the Bay region to help other states and jurisdictions.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Sounds like an excellent tool. So thank you so much for that great introduction for me, and really sharing that great, the great information. So I want to again just express gratitude toward Alexandra behind the scenes, helping us navigate technical issues, to Nancy Nunn for sharing this great presentation, and Sarah for all your work developing this workshop. Thank you, attendees, for your participation in the breakouts, etc. If you have a chance, please take a moment to review, submit an evaluation for the session, and feel free to keep the connection going using the WUVA platform. You can reach out to the speakers, the presenters here, connect with them that way, and they also shared their contact information. So I think we're going to wrap up a minute early, unless anybody has anything to add. Thanks so much for your time here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And thank you, Liz, for facilitating.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your
Thank
lunch
you.
this afternoon.
Oh, I was hoping to say something to Sarah and Nancy, but that's all right. I'll just email them.
Okay.
Great job, Liz.
So let's see now, did I give enough information at the end there? I told people to evaluate the session. Was there anything else?
Yes. Let me see if
I'm just saying, I think I covered it. Alexandra, if you have any tips for me in terms of facilitating, maybe reading the presentation ahead of time would help me. Feel free to share those. Email me a note or.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thanks
I
a lot.
appreciate that. Yeah, and if there's things that I missed that I can improve on, let me know too.
No, you did a great job. Thanks for helping me move through that. All right, I'm gonna head out. So it looks like the people that are now in the room are people for the next session. Is that what you think?
Yeah, that's what I'm guessing.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna head out. Take care.
Right,
Thanks, Ben.
You too.